Coming up next on At Your Service, we'll be discussing the impact of grief on children. Stay tuned.
Hello, today on At Your Service, we will be discussing the topic of grief and its impact on students. We would like to welcome to the studio Ms. Montgomery and Ms. Coale from the Chesapeake Life Center and Dr. Howlett, a school psychologist with Arundel County Public Schools. Welcome, ladies. If you would, could you tell me a little bit about yourselves?
I'm Kate Howlett. I'm a school psychologist in Arundel County for the past 11 years. So I'm a resource. I work directly with school staff, with families, parents, and with the students themselves.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sarah Montgomery, and I'm a clinical social worker, and I work for the Chesapeake Life Center. And the Chesapeake Life Center is under the umbrella of the Hospice of the Chesapeake, so we see families who are part of hospice, but also a lot of families who've had sudden deaths and other deaths in the community. I also do some trainings and outreach in the community.
I'm Susan Coale. Also a clinical social worker. I have a background in protective services and hospital social work, but for the last 10 years have been with Chesapeake Life Center, and I provide bereavement counseling for adults and families and children, as well as supervision for graduate interns, and do trainings and outreach in the community with Sarah.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting
What
us.
is grief, briefly?
Grief happens anytime there's a change, really, or loss. We tend to think of it in terms of death, but there are really many ways that we all experience grief just through the normal process of our lives. There can be an element of grief even in moving from, third grade to fourth grade, because there are changes. Different teachers, perhaps different friends, sometimes moving a different school. So there are a lot of ways in our lifetime that we experience and can learn how to manage grief and loss.
And it's really a process. I think for each person, it's kind of a journey that you have to go through depending on what your personal experiences are, what your cultural beliefs are, what the circumstances are. It's a journey.
Yes, yes.
I know that we talk about normal grief. Is there a spectrum, a level? Because, is there something that would not be a typical grief, or, when you work with children in the community or at the school level?
I think there's a broad range of what is normal grief, and I know in my years I think almost every single person I've seen is within that spectrum of normal grief. I do think, grief is a journey. We also, though, need to be aware of the anxiety and depression. So if we have some anxiety or depression before a loss, that may kind of rise up in the process. So sometimes we have to be, though grief is a normal journey, sometimes we do have to be aware of how anxiety and depression play into that journey.
And there are certainly factors that can complicate that grief process. When you have a sudden and unexpected loss, or you have cumulative losses where that person has repeatedly experienced loss, it can make the process more difficult. Or if there was an ambivalent, conflicted relationship with the person who's deceased, all of these things can make that process a little bit more complicated for the child.
Yeah, I guess a lot goes into it. You were going to say something, Ms. Coale?
Well, we tend to think of grief as an emotion, and really grief is more of a spectrum that impacts every part of us. One of the acronyms that we use is PEMS, that grief impacts us physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, and spiritually. And so I think it's helpful, especially with children, that we keep that in front of us, that a child who's presenting perhaps with physical symptoms also needs to be looked at. We need to look at that in the context of grief as well.
That's interesting. So can you speak a little bit more about each one of those areas that you mentioned?
Well, I can start if we can. So certainly emotionally, we think of grief. I think growing up, we always think of grief as emotion, and it certainly is. It's a spectrum. It's sadness, it's loneliness, it can be anxiety, sometimes it can be relief, sometimes it can be numbness. So all those feelings. But the physical part, I think, is really big with kids. And you know, we hear from school nurses that when there's been a loss or death or change, they get more visits to the nursing office because kids and adults, but kids particularly somaticize, which means hold their grief physically. Often it's tummy aches, but it can be headaches and things like that. So there's, you know, physically, I'll maybe mention how about cognitively, and then you can take on, but so the mentally or cognitively, most folks, particularly after a sudden death, have a hard time concentrating or following through in the same way they did prior to a loss. You come back to it eventually, but during that kind of the throes of the grief, and it really impacts the school.
It really does.
Because if you are expected to, after a death, come back and not only make up your work, but hit the ground running, that can really set up a child to feel like a failure, and we don't want to do that. So often we have to accommodate as a school. We may need to reduce the number of texts to read or the number of assignments to make it helpful. I know with me years ago, my mom died suddenly and I was a young social worker. If I had to go back and hit the ground running and not have support, I would have failed. And so we have to look at our children and the students and accommodate to support them as they come back to school and in school.
Right. And that's an interesting point, especially working with children, just experiencing our own issues with grief and loss of parents or family members, but everybody is on a different cycle. And so what little Susan, let's say if I was in school, my coming around might be different than her coming around.
Right.
And as a teacher or parent, we need to recognize where students are within that process. And how would that happen? How could that be so that parents are aware, or teachers or educators are aware where a student is within that process? Is it just asking them some questions or having some dialogue?
I think having an ongoing dialogue is extremely important. I mean, one thing that I think is important is for school staff, because you're kind of the front line. You spend a lot of time with kids, and you know, chances are there are many kids any day in any classroom that have some kind of bereavement that they're experienced or somewhere in the process. And it's not a process where on the 365th day you're done, you finished it, you completed it. You never graduate, so to speak. Things can bring it back. But having school staff know how and feel comfortable in talking with kids about loss. And that doesn't mean having an expansive conversation daily, but being that nurturant support that I'm here, I would talk about it. I think sometimes adults avoid talking with kids about grief because it's a hard thing to talk about, but that can give the message to students and your own children, we don't talk about it, it's not something to talk about. When really those open conversations, they really help kids to process that. As far as making accommodations, having parents communicate with school staff about losses, having teachers keep their eyes open, and be aware students that had academic vulnerabilities prior to experiencing a loss, those can be exacerbated, just to keep an eye on it.
Right, so that's really the key, staying in communication with the school, letting them know what's going on. And not just grief of somebody passing on, but other grief.
Other changes.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? What are some other things that can go on that in a student's life that can conjure up
Grief.
symptoms of grief?
There's such an array. You know, there's from moving neighborhoods in schools, having a best friend move away, parents separating or divorcing, deployment when a parent is going overseas, or even on an extended work trip. All those are changes. When someone with a parent or another family member may be physically there, but emotionally not there. There's a term that kind of covers all that ambiguous grief, and it's when it's not as clear cut as a death loss, but it is certainly a loss, and we see it a lot in foster care youth. And I know Susan's worked in protective services, but there's a lot of losses in that kind of way that need to be kind of honored, and given room for the kids to feel and to address those.
Even things like you know, economically, that can be a huge thing to grieve. I know I work in a largely middle class setting, but when the economy is very difficult, many times there are financial losses if a parent loses a job, and the life changes that go along with that can be very difficult for kids. Even sometimes joyful things like getting a new sibling unexpectedly. You can grieve the loss of what it was like to not have had that sibling.
Yeah. And we talked about the different components. You know, it was the social and spiritual. Do you want to address that?
And that, because I feel like that connects with what you were just saying, is that for a child who's experiencing a loss, whether it's a divorce or an incarcerated parent or a death, they feel different, and kids really want to fit in. And so it really does have that impact. That I think sometimes you might see it at school in terms of a withdrawal, just not wanting anybody to find out how different they are. And we hear over and over again when there's a support group in school or outside of school, just the fact that they discover that there's other children who have experienced something similar to what they're experiencing, just that takes such a burden off of kids.
I think that normalizing the experience of grief is probably one of the most powerful things that you can do. Not only for the kids themselves, I mean, even to know you might have a hard time concentrating. That's normal. You're not going crazy. You're not losing your skills. Things will get closer to how they were before. It will happen. And helping parents and teachers, everybody to know all of this range of reactions is normal.
And I think the whole going back to the normalizing piece is, I think sometimes when you have people that are struggling in and of themselves with, if it's a traumatic or a death, that sometimes they don't talk because they feel like they'll upset their children even more because they're struggling with it and through it. So are there any kind of tips or thoughts around when, you know, hearing parents watching this today that are also struggling but see their children struggling? Is there any thoughts around that?
I think we talk about it. That's the most important thing. Talk about it. It's okay if both of you cry. It's okay if you're having a hard time processing it as a parent. Just, it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to show emotions and to express it. That, you know, the parent is the model for the child and what that process is going to be like. So an open dialogue, I would say, and be honest. I know many times I've had situations where parents were not perhaps disclosing the exact truth about what had happened, particularly in a circumstance where there was a suicide or an overdose or, you know, something that's maybe more socially taboo to talk about it, and they were not honest about what had happened, and then that gets discovered, and it's difficult for the child then.
Yeah, it's good to keep that communication open and the parent and the child to talk about it and let them know it's okay to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important for parents to understand that the better care they take care of themselves, the better they'll be able to help their children. You know, we often get families who come to us and, you know, they don't want to get any help, but they want help for their children. And, you know, our focus is so often, let's work with the family, because the parents need to get support. They need to do what they can to get their rest and work on their grieving process, because the children do know what's going on with the parents.
Right, and that's the key, really. And sometimes I know that the parents don't feel comfortable approaching the school. They don't want their child to feel like, hey, you know, I'm going over your head, but they need to join to get forces together and say, hey, this is the best thing for everybody.
Yeah.
School staff can be a great resource in that way because they already have a nurturant relationship with the student, and they're less personally involved almost always in that loss. So sometimes they can be there in a different way than the parent can be.
Exactly. And we will be right back after this break.
Hi, thanks for watching AACPS TV. I'm Jody Rissy, the host for Food for Thought. Did you know that April is Healthy Anne Arundel Month? Join us in celebration as we create healthy students, healthy schools, and we cultivate communities of wellness. Anne Arundel County Public Schools is partnering with the Department of Health and Recreation and Parks, Anne Arundel Medical Center, Baltimore Washington Medical Center, and many more agencies to make health happen right here in Anne Arundel County. Log on to www.healthyannearundel.org to find a healthy event close to you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hernandez, Coordinator of World and Classical Languages. Do you want to learn Spanish? If so, tune in later today to AACPS TV because language matters.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Porter. And the Arundel County Public Schools Department of Transportation is raising the level of awareness for the safety of your children as we transport them to and from school. When a school bus stops to load students, as a driver, this is what you will see. At 150 feet, the bus will activate hazard lights. At 100 feet, the bus driver will activate the amber lights. They will start slowing down. At 10 feet before the bus stops, they will turn on the red bus lights. Their stop sign will come out, and students will begin to load. Once all students are on board safely, the bus driver will turn off red lights and move forward. At this time, it is safe for the motorist to resume movement.
Welcome back, and we're discussing the impact on grief. Thank you, and we're back again. So I have some follow-up questions that we kind of left off when we were talking a little bit before we left for break. And we talk about grief coming in waves. Can somebody explain the whole grief and the wave process?
I'd be happy to address it a bit. I think when we work with families or kids in the school or in our clinics,
community,
in the community, letting folks know that grief is not a stage. It's not it's not linear, it's not stages. It's really much more organic. And that we might feel kind of okay one day, and then a wave will come, and you'll feel kind of yucky, and then it will recede. But like a wave, it's natural, normal. You will come back to where you were. And waves can be little, or they can be tsunamis. And so one of the things I'll do with families is I'll have the parents and children talk about their grief wave. And if the mom or the dad is getting upset, that to name it, to say, I'm going through a grief wave, and this is a big one, or this, I'm going through a little grief wave. So the child knows what's going on. If a teacher is upset because they're grieving, teachers and staff grieve as well, they can name it. It's not about anything else going on in the class. I'm going through a grief wave related to my dad, or related to my dog, or what it is. So if we can name it, we can manage it. What is mentionable is manageable. And so I think when I hear back later from families I've worked with, they'll say the number one thing that was helpful was introducing the idea of wave. And even I have families who will do little hand signals to each other, like, oh, they know what's going on. So I think it's a helpful concept.
It's a good concept for the long run too, because I think a lot of times people sort of think the first year, you got to get through that first year. And the reality is the second year can be quite a bit more difficult, because in the first year you have a lot of people, recognizing anniversaries and giving support, and that support can fade over time as it's less in the forefront. And you get those grief waves that rise up, particularly when something new is coming up in your life. It's a transition. I mean, I know from my experience, my brother died at 27, and when I had my own children, I did not have children at the time that he died, my feelings for my parents, like what it would have been to lose a child, even though that was years in the past, it really brought up a lot of new grief waves for me that I had to kind of figure out and go through, because I was seeing it in a different way.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Very much. So thank you for explaining that. I think that's very helpful even for adults to be able to use that as well, not just for their children or students.
Absolutely.
But the big question, I think, Christy and I talk a little bit about this one, was, does television or technology contribute to grief?
Or what impact does it have?
Or is there an impact?
I know working with teenagers, social media is, such a huge part of their life, and I actually gave a lot of thought about this question, and I think that there's pros and cons, because on the one hand, social media can provide a support network for students, and it's a part of the support network that they already experience in their regular life. I mean, as adults, we want to do something when there's a loss. You want to make a casserole, write a card, and kids are less inclined and have less experience doing those kinds of things. Not that we can't help them to do them, but social media is their way to do something, to write a post. But it also lacks the face-to-face personal support. It can be overexposure to material that is not appropriate for that developmental age.
And just to piggyback on that, I think there are pros and cons. And I think one of the cons is that folks can overshare, and it can be re-traumatizing for others. They also hear so soon, you may not be actually sharing accurate information. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at. We have something that we have borrowed from kind of other areas, the idea of private versus secret, that it's not, for instance, if a dear one dies, for instance, by a drug overdose or a trauma, it's not a secret. But there may be some privacy. You may not want everyone in the world to know, or you may, but you need to look through that. And to be able to talk about it with a parent or a guiding adult prior to posting something can be very helpful. It's hard to do because people jump on there. I know with Robin Williams' death, I heard it through one of my teenagers before I heard, Mom, you know, Robin Williams died, and then I kind of listened in. But often we do now hear from our own kids or students, and we don't have time to kind of process to talk back. So it's added a whole nother variable of immediacy in our work.
I think a couple of things come to mind. One, in terms of, you asked also about television, and with the news reporting and over and over and over again, you know, and of course everybody goes back to 9/11 and watching those events over and over. That that's not really helpful for our children. That is indeed traumatizing and re-traumatizing. And so as parents, we need to be aware of that. Are we having that news channel on going all the time? And what impact is that having on our children? So there's monitoring, I think, that needs to happen there. And the other place, which is much more delicate sometimes, is with the social media. That when there is a tragedy or you know, something really difficult that happens in the community, how can parents monitor what's happening with their own child in social media?
Yeah, and that raises the question too. When should a parent really get involved with their child's grief? When do they know when it's time to step in and help their child?
I think you get involved right at the beginning.
Okay.
You're not waiting for it to be a problem. I think you're getting involved. It's a process, and you know, to be even talking to kids about death in general. You don't have to wait until something happened to talk to your kids about death and to help them to understand it. That can happen before there's a loss.
And I agree. I think modeling that as a family or as a classroom, you can talk about, even if it's really hard, we can talk about anything. If you do that, if you model that with your family, then as other things come up in their lives, they'll know it won't be easy, but we can do it. And I think that's such an important message and part of that building resilience.
With the coping.
With the
So
coping.
life is not always going to be easy, but it is part of the process
Right.
and how to cope and how to talk about it.
And we can do it together. We can do anything together. Our family can do anything together. And I think that if you could have that early on, especially then going to the teen years when people are kind of going, you can say, I don't want to talk about, but we will talk about it. We can.
Because you have that plan in place.
Exactly.
Right.
We have that stepping stone.
Right.
We've already started teaching about loss with, you know, dead birds in the garden and lost pets.
Right, pets
and,
are
you know,
huge.
yeah, and just building general coping skills comes in real helpful.
How do you feel about funerals? Should children attend funerals?
This is perhaps a question, the
a
most
lot.
asked question that
Yes.
parents will ask when they call and say that there's been a loss.
Correct.
My professional and personal opinion is there are a lot of benefits to allowing your child to go to a funeral. I would probably ask the child if they want to go. I would not force a child to go to a funeral that really adamantly did not want to go to a funeral. But for us as adults, it's a ritual that has a lot of meaning. It's a chance to see people expressing emotion and receiving support. I think a lot of times kids' fantasies about what is the funeral going to be like are more horrifying than what an actual funeral is. So I think if you've done the work to prepare your child about it, it can be really a meaningful experience for them.
And I think I agree, it can be very meaningful. It's not for everybody and would never kind of push to a point of anxiety. The couple things we do suggest that if when a child goes to a funeral service is to have a special adult there who can go in and out of the room, whether it's the bathroom or take a break outside, and know that that's okay, because they can't touch the pain in their feelings as long as adults can. So taking those breaks. If a child really doesn't want to go, to have them do something, for instance, write a little note, pick out a favorite little bear, and then bring that to the service for the child, because as adults we're actually holding the narrative of our children's grief. So you can say, John, when you were 4, you drew the cutest little scribbly picture, and I put it by your grandpa's coffin, and that was special. So you can hold that for them. So we actually, especially when the kids are little, we are holding it, and we are able to help that narrative. So I wanted to add that in.
Yeah. And I think one of the real keys for children is preparation.
Yeah.
Let them know what to expect. Let them know that, you know, people may be crying and that that's okay. You know, even to talking about the smell of what the funeral home will be like. You know, there's that flowery sort of scent. So as much as you can prepare them, that decreases their anxiety and makes it easier for them to go and experience that.
I think letting kids know also, like, that people might laugh, people will smile. Sometimes kids have that belief that a funeral or a memorial service, it's just going to be, you know, nonstop weeping. But sometimes it's really a celebration of that person's life, and that can be sometimes a mismatch for kids. But to prepare them, like, it could look like this, it could look like that, and kids might ask the same things over and over again. So be prepared to answer those questions over and over again, and it's okay to say, I don't know, if you don't know.
Yeah.
And one other thing to add, in some traumatic situations where the whole community is very upset or something like that, or grieving deeply, it isn't always just an either or, just attend the service or don't attend. A service is a way of honoring your own grief and showing love and care to the family that's grieving. So one family may choose to go to the park and have a picnic and write little letters, or they may go and blow bubbles, love bubbles in an area and think about the special person who died. So I think that's important, that it's a ritual that helps acknowledge and respect your grief and send love to the family. So there's other alternatives as well, depending on your family.
So we have a couple more minutes, and so what kind of resources? I know for the Life Center, it's community. So when you have parents that are watching today or grandparents watching today, and you think about community resources or school resources, what could you share with the audience if they need some additional support?
I can speak to the school resources.
Okay.
I think we're looking at two different things in the sense of school staff are sometimes just providing bereavement support. You're just helping kids through a normal process. You're that nurturant person that's available to talk. And then you're keeping an eye to look at, is this getting to a point where it's of concern? Then the second level of defense, there are highly trained people that work in your school building that are able to provide services to students. School psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, those are your people to call and say, I'm worried about my kid, what do I do? A lot of schools are running grief groups, providing grief counseling. And if there's even a further level of concern where you really need a therapeutic intervention, there's community resources, which we can talk a little bit about.
So you want me to? I'll start. So where we are, Chesapeake Life Center, is there's similar organizations in other counties and in other states. A lot of hospices will have bereavement support services that are open to the community as well. I know where we are, we offer monthly groups for adults and for children. The children's group's on a Saturday morning, and you make pancakes and crafts as you talk, so trying to normalize the feelings and make it not be scary. We also have a wonderful camp every August where kids get together, kids who've lost a parent, a sibling, or a guardian, grandparent. And it's at Arlington Echo, which is an Arundel school property. And they feel, which we talked about before, it normalizes their grief, but also learning coping techniques and enjoying it in a beautiful setting. So it sounds heavy, but actually a lot of the kids have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So those are resources, groups and camps, as well as individual counseling.
Well, I appreciate, ladies, your time today. I think Anne Arundel County has wonderful resources with the Life Center. You know, I've been in other systems and they don't have, I think, the expansion of the Life Center and all the services that are offered for our system. But I would like to thank our audience today for joining us. Stay tuned next time on At Your Service.